Imagine the year is roughly 15 centuries before the birth of Christ. The world looks immensely different from the one we know today. Great kingdoms rise and fall across Mesopotamia. Egypt stands tall with its pharaohs and monuments. Greece is still centuries away from reaching the height of its classical glory. Rome does not yet exist even as a dream. And scattered along the narrow coastlines where the mountains of Lebanon meet the Mediterranean Sea, a group of people quietly build a civilization that will influence the world in ways even they cannot imagine. They do not shout their achievements through grand empires or colossal stone monuments. Instead, their impact spreads through the rhythm of waves, the routes of sailors, the patterns of trade, and the simple but revolutionary idea of symbols that represent sound. These are the Phoenicians, an ancient people whose name many hear but few truly understand. To picture the world they inhabited, imagine a coastline dotted with natural harbors, sheltered bays, and small but strategically placed city-states. Each one is a living organism, vibrant and bustling, humming with artisans, merchants, and shipbuilders. There is no vast kingdom, no single ruler commanding the entire territory. Instead, these cities, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Arwad, and later the mighty Carthage, exist like jewels strung along a maritime necklace. They are independent but connected, competitive but culturally aligned, each adding its own thread to the tapestry of Phoenician identity. Their geography shapes who they are. The sea becomes their highway, their shield, and their livelihood. The mountains behind them make inland expansion difficult, but the horizon in front of them beckons with endless possibility. From an early age, children in these coastal towns grow up hearing the constant sounds of shipyards, wood being cut, ropes tightening, sails flapping, and merchants shouting prices in multiple tongues. The scent of cedar wood, one of the region's greatest treasures, fills the air. Phoenician cedar is strong, fragrant, resistant to decay, and straight-grained, perfect for ships, temples, and palaces. Even mighty Egypt values this cedar so highly that pharaohs send expeditions to procure it. This wood becomes the skeleton of Phoenician ships that will sail farther than any of their neighboring civilizations dare to go. Life in these city-states is shaped by movement. Every sunrise brings ships returning with stories of distant shores, of strange customs, unfamiliar gods, new materials, and new opportunities. Unlike other ancient civilizations whose power rests on land conquest, the Phoenicians discover that influence can also come through connection. They master the art of navigating the Mediterranean, and their vessels glide gracefully across waters that other cultures consider dangerous or unknown. The Mediterranean Sea, with its storms and unpredictable winds, is not an easy place to travel, but to the Phoenicians it becomes a second home. They learn its patterns intimately, the way the stars shift across the night sky, the behavior of waves near rocky shores, the color of the water before a storm, and the subtle changes of wind that mark the seasons. Before they ever become known for their alphabet or their colonies, the Phoenicians become known for their courage at sea. Traders from inland regions and foreign kingdoms recognize their docks as gateways to the world. Their markets fill with exotic items, silver from Spain, tin from Britain, spices from Arabia, gold from Egypt, wine from Greece, textiles from Mesopotamia. Every object carries a story of distance and negotiation. The Phoenicians do not simply transport goods, they transmit cultures, ideas, and technologies, acting as intermediaries in a world that is still fragmented and slow to connect. In this era, most people rarely travel beyond their homeland. But the Phoenician world view is shaped by constant contact with diversity. Their minds stretch as wide as the sea they traverse. When a Phoenician child grows up, He or she may already have seen ships from multiple nations, heard several languages, and met travelers from lands that many civilizations have never heard of. This exposure breeds adaptability, curiosity, and a subtle confidence, qualities that define the Phoenician spirit. Yet despite all their accomplishments, the Phoenicians remain somewhat mysterious even to modern historians. This is partly because they left behind few monumental inscriptions or grand historical accounts. Much of what we know about them comes from the writings of other civilizations, Greeks, Egyptians, Assyrians, and Romans, who described the Phoenicians based on their interactions with them. To understand them fully, one must imagine a people more interested in the flow of goods and ideas than in carving their legacy in stone. Their history is not written in giant temples or fortified walls. It is written in trade networks, in borrowed alphabets, in dyes that color the robes of royalty, and in the colonies they establish across the Mediterranean. One of the most famous of these contributions is their purple dye, a substance so valuable that it becomes a symbol of power, wealth, and nobility. The process of extracting this dye is slow, difficult, and expensive. Workers collect thousands of murex sea snails, crack their shells, and extract a tiny amount of liquid from each one. This liquid is then exposed to sunlight, gradually transforming into shades of rich purple and deep crimson. The smell is terrible, so bad, in fact, that dye workshops are placed far outside the cities, but the resulting color is magnificent. Only the elite of the ancient world can afford garments dyed in this precious pigment. In a way, the Phoenicians become the world's first luxury brand, exporting a product that symbolizes prestige across kingdoms and continents. Some historians believe the Greeks named them Phoenicians, from the word phoenix, meaning purple, red, because of this very dye. But beyond commerce and craft, the Phoenicians developed something even more extraordinary, a mindset built on exploration. They are not explorers for glory or conquest. They explore because exploration is woven into their identity. Every shoreline they encounter becomes an opportunity. Every foreign port becomes a relationship. Every cultural difference becomes a learning experience. They understand something that many ancient powers do not, that the world is vast, interconnected, and full of resources waiting to be discovered and exchanged. This world shapes the way they build their society, their economy, and eventually their greatest intellectual contribution to humanity. As centuries pass, these city-states grow in wealth and influence. Their ships sail deeper into the Mediterranean, reaching Cyprus, Crete, Malta, Sicily, Sardinia, the Balearic Islands, and finally the coasts of North Africa and southern Spain. They establish trading stations and settlements, some of which grow into powerful cities. Among these, one will rise above all others, Carthage, founded by settlers from Tyre. It will later become a formidable empire in its own right, rivaling Rome and leaving a legacy that both preserves and expands the influence of its Phoenician ancestors. To truly understand the Phoenicians, one must let go of the idea that history is shaped only by conquerors, warriors, and monumental builders. The Phoenicians show that a civilization can shape the world quietly, through navigation instead of domination, through commerce instead of conquest, through communication instead of force. Their impact is subtle but deep, woven into the foundations of modern culture like threads in a fabric. They are the connectors, the translators, the intermediaries of the ancient world. Their story begins not with the rise of kings, but with the rise of ships, not with battles, but with voyages, not with monuments that scrape the sky, but with ideas that travel across it. And in understanding their world, we gain a deeper appreciation for how civilizations grow not just through power, but through curiosity, creativity, and the courage to venture beyond the horizon. When we turn to the heart of Phoenician life, the land they inhabited and the dye that made them legendary, we step into a world shaped by geography, opportunity, and a remarkable sense of resourcefulness. The Phoenicians lived in a narrow strip of land wedged between the Mediterranean Sea and the steep mountains of Lebanon. This geography defined almost every aspect of their lives. The coastline was not broad enough to support a sprawling inland empire. The mountains blocked expansion toward the east, and rival powers in Mesopotamia constantly threatened any aspirations the Phoenicians might have had for territorial dominance. But what seemed like limitations to other civilizations became gateways to innovation for them. Instead of turning inland, the Phoenicians turned outward, toward the sea, the horizon, and the world beyond. Their homeland was small, but it was fertile and rich in materials that mattered deeply in the ancient world. The towering cedar trees of Lebanon stood like natural monuments, stretching their green crowns toward the sky, rising from forests that had been revered for millennia. These cedars became symbols of power themselves, so prized that Egyptian pharaohs sent entire fleets to Phoenician ports solely to acquire them. The wood was strong, aromatic, long, lasting, and resistant to insects. It was perfect for ships, temples, palaces, and monumental construction. To the Phoenicians, these forests were more than natural resources. They were foundations for economic prosperity, diplomatic relevance, and maritime supremacy. Imagine walking through one of these cities, perhaps Sidon, one of the oldest and most influential among them. The streets are narrow, busy, and filled with voices, merchants negotiating prices, sailors preparing ropes and sails, craftsmen carving wood, women carrying baskets of grain, and children weaving between stalls. The smell of the sea blends with the scent of cedar, olive oil, wine, and spices. Every corner of the city, every alley, every workshop reflects the same underlying truth. The Phoenicians are a people built on trade, craftsmanship, and connectivity. Among their many crafts, one stands out above all others: the production of the famous purple dye. This dye was not simply a luxury item. It was the product that placed the Phoenicians at the center of ancient Mediterranean trade. It made them wealthy, influential, and recognizable. The dye came from a humble creature, the murex snail, which lived in the shallow coastal waters and rocky shores near their cities. The production of this dye was not glamorous. In fact, it was grueling, smelly, and laborious. To extract a small amount of purple pigment, workers had to collect thousands of snails. The snails were cracked open with tools, and the tiny gland inside them was carefully removed. This gland contained a pale, milky fluid that, when exposed to air and sunlight, gradually turned into shades of deep purple and crimson. The process was slow and messy. Workers had to boil the extracted liquid in large vats for hours or even days. The stench produced by this process was overwhelming. Ancient writers noted that dye workshops were always located far outside city walls because no one wanted to live near the overpowering smell. It clung to workers' clothes, their hair, and even their skin. A Phoenician dyer may have been poor financially, but in a crowd you would recognize him instantly because the scent never washed away completely. And yet, the result of this unpleasant, labor-intensive process was one of the most coveted materials in the ancient world. Purple was the color of power. Kings wore it to show their authority. Priests wore it to signify their sacred roles. High-ranking officials wore it as a symbol of wealth and status. In some societies, it became so valuable that possessing purple, dyed cloth without permission could lead to fines or punishment. Because the dye was so rare and expensive to produce, it cost more than its weight in gold. This made the Phoenicians central players in international trade, as they were the unrivaled masters of this precious craft. Their reputation grew. When foreign merchants saw the deep purple cloth in a marketplace, they knew it came from Phoenician hands. The dye became synonymous with the people themselves. Some ancient scholars believe this is why the Greeks used the term phoenix, meaning purple, red, or crimson, to describe them. Whether the name Phoenician was inspired by their dye or by their own cultural designation remains debated, but the association is unmistakable. Purple was not just a commodity, it was an identity. What's fascinating about the Phoenicians is that their economic success did not come from dominating land or enforcing political control. They thrived because they controlled materials, skills, and knowledge that other civilizations depended on. They were the producers of fine goods, the connectors of trade routes, and the keepers of secrets, especially when it came to the dye. The formula for producing Tyrian purple, one of their most famous dye variations, was guarded closely. Even the methods described by ancient writers were incomplete, likely because the Phoenicians intentionally concealed parts of the process. It was their intellectual property, their economic advantage, and their pathway to prestige. The dye industry influenced much of their society. It shaped economic structures, trade partnerships, and even city layouts. Ports needed space to store raw materials and finished textiles. Workshops needed access to water. Large storage houses were built for wool, silk, and linen. Ships had dedicated cargo spaces designed to transport dyed cloth safely without damage. Every stage of the process, from snail collection to dye extraction, from weaving to export, required coordination, skill, and labor. It created jobs, encouraged specialization, and strengthened the connection between Phoenician city, states, and foreign markets. But the dye was only part of the story. The land that produced it also gave rise to other valuable industries. The Phoenicians were skilled metalworkers, potters, carpenters, glassmakers, and jewelers. They created beads, rings, goblets, and ornaments that traveled all across the Mediterranean. Their glasswork was especially admired. They were among the earliest cultures to produce clear glass, a technology that changed how glass was used and valued. Their pottery often featured elegant shapes and intricate patterns, mixing influences from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and local traditions. This blend of styles reflected their role as cultural intermediaries, absorbing ideas from every civilization they traded with and creating something new. Despite their small territory, Phoenician cities were bustling hubs of craftsmanship and commerce. Their wealth came from how effectively they used the natural resources available to them. The mountains gave them cedar, the sea gave them fish, snails, and trade routes. The coastline gave them natural harbors. Their dye industry gave them international prestige, and their skills as artisans and shipbuilders gave them strategic importance in a world where land-based empires often relied on them for materials they couldn't get elsewhere. In these cities, life was a mix of hard labor and cultural richness. Fishermen set out before dawn to collect murex snails from the shallow waters. Dyers worked long hours stirring vats of boiling liquid. Sailors loaded ships with cedar logs, dyed cloth, glassware, and pottery. Merchants negotiated with foreign buyers. Priests performed rituals in temples dedicated to gods like Astarte, Baal, and Melkart. Children grew up listening to stories of far-off lands, learning about navigation, trade, and craftsmanship. The social structure of these cities reflected the importance of trade. Wealth was often measured not by land ownership, or the size of one's army, but by the size of one's fleet, the success of one's trading ventures, or the quality of one's workshop. Families who controlled dye production or shipbuilding became influential. Merchants who established long-distance trade networks rose to wealth and prestige. Skilled craftsmen gained recognition across the region. The Phoenicians' relationship with their land was one of symbiosis. They respected the resources that sustained them and understood how to manage them for the long term. They harvested cedar in a way that allowed forests to regenerate. They regulated the collection of murex snails to prevent depletion. They built their economy not on exploitation, but on renewal and craftsmanship. This respect for natural resources contributed to the long-term survival of their cities, even as foreign empires rose and fell around them. The land shaped them, but the dye, purple, rare, and unforgettable, became their signature. It gave them identity, wealth, and influence. It turned their small coastal cities into international trading powers. And it remains one of the most iconic symbols of the ancient world, forever linked to the people who mastered its creation. From the moment a Phoenician child first opened their eyes to the world, the sea was already part of their life. It wasn't simply a body of water to them. It was the road, the promise, the opportunity, the danger, and the destiny of their people. The Mediterranean stretched endlessly in front of their cities, shimmering under the sun, whispering with waves, and carrying with it the mysteries of lands far beyond the horizon. While other civilizations saw the ocean as a barrier, the Phoenicians saw it as an invitation. Their entire world was shaped not by fields or deserts or mountains, but by the rhythm of tides and the pull of distant shores. And so they grew into what history would one day call them, the masters of the Mediterranean Sea. To understand the magnitude of what they achieved, imagine the world before compasses, before accurate maps, before lighthouses, before safe harbors marked with buoys and lights. Navigation was a skill somewhere between science and instinct, requiring a kind of courage that few could even fathom. Most ancient peoples stayed close to the shoreline, terrified of being swallowed by storms, currents, and the vast unknown. But Phoenician sailors ventured far because their livelihood depended on reaching lands that others feared to approach. Their ships became extensions of themselves, floating homes, trading posts, fortresses, and symbols of a culture that lived through movement. The shipyards of Phoenician cities were among the busiest places a visitor could witness. From dawn till dusk, craftsmen hammered planks of cedar wood, bent hulls into shape, twisted ropes, stitched sails, polished oars, and tested every part of the vessel. Shipbuilding wasn't simply a job. It was an art inherited through generations. A master shipbuilder was respected as much as a priest or a scholar. Young boys watched their fathers and grandfathers, learning how to shape a keel, how to set ribbing inside a hull, how to make a ship strong enough to cut through waves, yet flexible enough to bend during a storm. The Mediterranean's unpredictable nature required ships that could endure its moods. The Phoenicians perfected two main types, the trading ship and the warship. Their trading vessels, called galloi, were round, bellied, wide, and sturdy. These ships could carry enormous quantities of goods, cedar logs, purple, dyed cloth, glassware, pottery, metals, spices, and grains. Their design allowed them to stay balanced even in rough seas, and they used large sails that harnessed the wind to minimize rowing. Warships, like the later biremes, were sleek, narrow, and fast, powered by rows of oarsmen who moved in unison like the strokes of a giant heartbeat. These vessels could outrun pirates and protect merchant fleets. Because the Phoenicians mastered the art of shipbuilding, they mastered the art of the sea. Their sailors learned to read the stars as if they were words written across the night sky. They knew that the North Star held steady and could guide them even when clouds blocked familiar landmarks. They understood the seasonal winds, the gentle summer breezes that carried them westward, and the harsh winter winds that warned them to shelter in safe harbors. They recognized the behavior of birds, the shape of waves, the smell of storms before they came. Every journey began not with a map, but with a calculation of risks, a knowledge of nature, and a trust in the craftsmanship of their ships. When a Phoenician trading expedition set sail, it was an event that rippled through the city. Merchants gathered to check inventories, families stood at the docks to see off loved ones, priests performed rituals, offering prayers and incense to protect the sailors from the unpredictable moods of the sea gods. And as the ships pulled away from the shore, the city watched until the sails shrank into the horizon, knowing that weeks or months might pass before they returned. Once at sea, the Phoenicians became both explorers and traders. Their voyages took them to Cyprus, where they acquired copper, to the Greek islands, where they exchanged goods for olive oil and wine, to Crete and Rhodes, where they traded purple cloth for pottery and bronze. They sailed to North Africa and founded settlement after settlement along its coast. They reached Malta, Sicily, Sardinia, and the Balearic Islands. Their ships crossed the narrow strait into the Atlantic, where they traded with peoples along the coasts of Spain and Portugal. There, they gained access to silver mines so rich that ancient writers claimed the Phoenicians accumulated silver in such quantities that they used it to ballast their ships, tossing excess metal into the sea because they had more than they could carry home. The further west they traveled, the more influence they spread. They established trading posts that eventually grew into full cities: Gades, modern Cadiz in Spain, Lixus in Morocco, Carthage in North Africa. Carthage itself would later rise to overshadow even its parent cities, forging an empire that rivaled Rome. But before Carthage ever challenged the Roman Republic, it was simply one of many Phoenician harbors that connected the east and west of the Mediterranean. For the Phoenicians, the sea was not only an economic highway, it was a cultural bridge. Wherever they went, they encountered new peoples, new languages, new gods, and new customs. Rather than resisting these differences, they embraced them. They adjusted their goods to foreign tastes. They learned basic phrases in multiple languages. They married local women, creating families that blended traditions. They adopted foreign technologies and influenced others with their own. In a world where civilizations often remained isolated, the Phoenicians acted as translators between cultures, transmitting ideas across continents. Their networks of trade were so extensive that they became the backbone of Mediterranean commerce. A pot made in Cyprus might end up in a home in Sicily because a Phoenician ship carried it there. A bronze tool crafted in Greece might reach Egypt through Sidonian merchants. A piece of purple, dyed cloth made in Tyre might be worn by a king in Mesopotamia. These connections created a web of exchange that tied together the ancient world long before the concept of globalization existed. Through these interactions, art styles blended, technologies spread. Languages borrowed words from one another. Religious symbols crossed borders. The Mediterranean evolved into a shared cultural sphere thanks largely to the Phoenician sailors who navigated it. But being the masters of the Mediterranean did not come without danger. The sea was unpredictable, and every journey carried risks. A sudden storm could overturn a ship, tearing sails and snapping masts with violent force. Pirates roamed the waters, attacking merchant vessels and looting cargo. Rival kingdoms eyed Phoenician ships with envy, sometimes ambushing them or restricting their access to certain ports. But the Phoenicians adapted. They learned to sail close enough to the coast to find shelter quickly during storms, yet far enough to avoid dangerous rocks and ambushes. They traveled in fleets for protection. They trained sailors to fight with spears, bows, and slings. They improved their ship designs after every mishap, learning from failure and refining their technology. Even with all these risks, the call of the sea remained irresistible to them. A Phoenician sailor might spend months away from home, braving storms, hunger, and nights of uncertainty. Yet upon returning, he would recount stories of distant temples, strange foods, foreign markets, and new inventions. These stories inspired others. They fueled ambition. They made the children of Phoenician cities dream of lands beyond the horizon. In this way, the Phoenician mastery of the sea wasn't just about ships or goods. It was about a mindset that embraced the unknown. They believed that the world was not something to fear, but something to explore, to learn from, and to connect with. Even today, ruins of Phoenician settlements dot the coasts of Europe and North Africa like echoes of their maritime empire. Archaeologists still find Phoenician pottery in places so distant that many once doubted they could have reached them. Modern sailors still marvel at the techniques Phoenicians used to navigate without advanced instruments. And historians continue to uncover evidence suggesting that the Phoenicians may have accomplished feats long thought impossible, such as circumnavigating Africa centuries before European explorers. Their mastery of the Mediterranean laid the foundation for everything else they achieved: their trade networks, their cultural influence, their spread of the alphabet, and their creation of colonies that shaped history long after their original cities declined. They were not conquerors in the usual sense. They did not impose their rule with armies. Instead, they conquered through mobility, intelligence, diplomacy, and skill. Their power came from their ability to read the sea, adapt to new environments, and understand the needs of the people they traded with. In the end, the Mediterranean belonged to many civilizations, but it was the Phoenicians who truly unlocked it. They stitched together its coasts with routes of commerce and communication. They transformed it from a fragmented collection of isolated shores into a spinning wheel of cultural exchange. They proved that a small band of coastal cities could wield influence far greater than their size if they mastered the art of connection. The sea was their teacher, their challenge, their passion, and their legacy. And through their ships, those wooden vessels carved from cedar and propelled by wind and determination, the world became larger, richer, and more connected than ever before. The Phoenicians' rise as unrivaled masters of trade did not happen by accident, nor was it the result of a single brilliant innovation. It was the cumulative effect of geography, necessity, craftsmanship, daring, and an almost instinctive understanding of how to turn the rhythm of the sea into an empire without walls. To understand how Phoenician trade networks grew into one of the ancient world's most powerful economic engines, you have to picture their world the way they saw it, not as land-bound kingdoms with rigid borders, but as strings of coastlines, ports, and islands, each one a potential node in an ever-expanding commercial web. Their homeland pushed them in that direction from the start. Nestled between the mountains of Lebanon and the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea, their territory was narrow and resource-limited. Unlike the Egyptians, they had no vast farmlands. Unlike the Mesopotamians, they had no sprawling river valleys. What they did have were forests, legendary, towering cedar forests, and harbors. The coastline was dotted with natural inlets and deep water bays ideal for anchoring ships. The sea was not an obstacle to them, it was an invitation. And so, with the cedars as material and the Mediterranean as a highway, they built a civilization around movement. One of the earliest steps toward their maritime dominance was mastering shipbuilding. The Phoenicians were obsessive about the craft. They didn't simply build vessels to float. They built vessels to endure, to travel far, and to return home with treasures from lands people barely knew existed. Cedar wood, with its straight grain, resistance to rot, and buoyant strength, became the backbone of their fleets. Their shipwrights experimented constantly: wider hulls for stability, deeper keels for long-distance travel, improved sails that caught the wind efficiently, and reinforced frames that could withstand storms. Eventually, they designed two primary types of ships: merchant ships for cargo and long, sleek biremes for speed and defense. The merchant ships were broad, rounded, and sturdy, shaped like floating storage containers. The biremes, meanwhile, had two levels of oarsmen and could glide across the sea with speed unparalleled in that era. Together, these vessels allowed the Phoenicians to dominate every maritime route across the Mediterranean and even beyond. But a ship, no matter how well built, is only as valuable as the routes it sails, and the Phoenicians were master navigators, combining observation, memory, and calculated daring. They studied currents, winds, stars, and coastlines. They learned when the Mediterranean slept peacefully and when it raged. They memorized the timing of storms, the direction of seasonal winds like the Etesians, and the safe harbors sprinkled across the sea. They became so skilled that even later Greek historians admitted with a mix of admiration and frustration that Phoenicians knew the sea better than anyone else. Navigation became their secret weapon. They did not reveal routes easily. Even the story of the Carthaginian navigator Himilco traveling to the Atlantic coast of Europe, or Hanno journeying along West Africa, was told with deliberate vagueness. They guarded their maps, if they even used physical maps at all, and passed their knowledge from sailors to apprentices through oral tradition. Secrecy protected their commercial dominance, but what exactly did they trade? The short answer is everything profitable. The long answer reveals a complex, interconnected economy. Their most prized export was the famous Tyrian purple dye, produced from the murex sea snail. It was costly, painstaking to extract, and required thousands of snails to produce even a small amount of dye, but the resulting color, a deep, almost shimmering purple, became synonymous with royalty. Kings, queens, and high-ranking priests from Egypt to Greece to Rome treasured it. The Phoenicians controlled its production and distribution, effectively cornering one of the ancient world's most valuable luxury markets. They also sold fine textiles, especially intricately dyed garments that combined colors and patterns available nowhere else. Their artisans were skilled beyond their time, and their fabrics became status symbols among elites across the Mediterranean. Wood was another major commodity. The cedar of Lebanon was famed for its durability and scent, and civilizations like Egypt, whose own resources were limited, depended heavily on Phoenician timber for shipbuilding, monumental construction, and religious artifacts. Many Egyptian temples rose with beams transported from Phoenician ports. Glass, too, became a hallmark of Phoenician craftsmanship. They were among the earliest to innovate techniques for colored and clear glass, producing beads, vessels, and ornaments that archaeologists still uncover in surprising places. Their glass products were lightweight, decorative, and universally admired. Beyond these luxury items, they acted as the middlemen of the ancient world. They transported metals from Spain, tin from Britain, ivory and gold from Africa, spices from Arabia, and countless other items that moved between civilizations long before any central government attempted to control global trade. They were the connective tissue of the Mediterranean economy, linking cultures that might never have interacted directly. But the Phoenicians did not simply trade goods. They traded ideas, stories, technologies, and cultural practices. Wherever they went, they introduced new artistic styles, new methods of crafting, new religious symbols, and new concepts of writing. they brought back foreign innovations and incorporated them into their own society. This exchange made them not just merchants but cultural ambassadors. Their trade network expanded through practical steps. First, they established friendly agreements with coastal cities, offering goods in exchange for safe anchorage. Then, as they became familiar faces in foreign markets, they built small warehouses, then settlements, then full-fledged colonies. These colonies became supply stations, repair hubs, and commercial outposts that allowed them to extend their sailing range far beyond what any other ancient civilization had attempted. The most famous of these colonies was Carthage, founded according to tradition by settlers from the Phoenician city of Tyre. Carthage would eventually grow into a powerful empire itself, but its roots were purely commercial, an extension of Phoenician trade strategy. Colonies like Carthage, Gade's modern Cadiz in Spain, Lixus in Morocco, Matia in Sicily, and many more served as stepping stones in a massive maritime chain. A Phoenician ship could sail along the North African coast, stop for supplies in Tripolitania, cross to Malta, then Sicily, then Sardinia, then Spain, all along routes marked by familiar ports with friendly populations. Because they had colonies everywhere, they avoided long stretches of dangerous open sea travel. Instead, they used coastal hopping, a technique in which they sailed close to land, stopping frequently. This minimized risks and maximized trade efficiency. Everywhere they went, the Phoenicians cultivated relationships. They offered valuable goods, displayed reliability, and adapted to local expectations. They were not conquerors, they were connectors. Their influence spread because they built trust through fairness, intelligence, and consistency. This gave them access to markets that were closed to more aggressive or militaristic civilizations. Their diplomatic approach also meant they rarely needed large armies. The sea and their ships were their defense. Their biremes were fast enough to flee pirates or naval threats. And their widespread networks meant that even if one port suffered an attack or blockade, dozens of others remained open, allowing their economy to keep flowing. In many ways, they were the first civilization to understand global diversification. Their commercial success also encouraged internal specialization. In Phoenician cities, you would find entire districts dedicated to specific industries: dye workshops in Tyre, shipyards in Byblos, glass furnaces in Sidon. Master craftsmen trained apprentices who became masters themselves, perpetuating the cycle of innovation, and innovation never stopped. They improved weighing systems, measurements, and bookkeeping methods. They standardized cargo packaging. They used early forms of contracts. They even contributed to the evolution of the alphabet, making writing simpler and more accessible, which in turn supported commerce. One of the most remarkable characteristics of Phoenician trade was their comfort with traveling into the unknown. While other civilizations hugged familiar boundaries, the Phoenicians pushed past them. They sailed beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, what the Greeks called the Pillars of Heracles, into the vast Atlantic. Few dared to go there. The sea was rougher, the currents stronger, the winds unpredictable. Yet Phoenician ships ventured to the coasts of Spain, Portugal, and possibly even Britain. Some ancient sources even claim they circumnavigated Africa under commission from Egyptian pharaohs. Whether or not this is fully accurate, it reflects the widespread respect, or fear, others had for their nautical capabilities. Their long-distance voyages weren't only about exploration. They were calculated business decisions. They searched for metals, especially silver and tin. These were essential for creating bronzes, tools, weapons, and ornaments. When they found rich deposits in Spain, they established colonies and built partnerships with local tribes. As a result, Phoenician merchants returned home laden with treasure. so much that some ancient writers exaggerated that Phoenician ships were so heavy with silver they nearly sank. The scale of their trade network eventually created a ripple effect that reshaped the entire Mediterranean economy. Prices of goods shifted based on Phoenician availability. Foreign artisans adapted their styles to imitate Phoenician craftsmanship. Kingdoms adjusted their political alliances to secure trade benefits. Even wars were fought over access to key ports and resources the Phoenicians controlled. But perhaps the greatest strength of the Phoenician trade system was its flexibility. They didn't depend on any single commodity or region. If one market faltered, they shifted to another. If a route became dangerous, they found alternatives. If a new opportunity appeared, like the rising demand for metals in the Greek world, they moved swiftly to capitalize on it. Because of this adaptability, the Phoenicians remained relevant for centuries. Kingdoms rose and fell around them, but they continued sailing, trading, and thriving. Their commercial success also influenced their social structure. Wealthy merchant families held great power. Ships were often funded by family groups or partnerships, and profits were shared. Commerce created a class of maritime elites who invested in expeditions, sponsored artisans, and sometimes even influenced political decisions within their cities. Temples also played a surprising role in trade. In many Phoenician cities, temples acted as banks or financial institutions. Merchants entrusted temples with wealth, and temples used that wealth to fund long-distance voyages. This blend of religion and commerce created a unique stability. Sacred institutions ensured that economic activities were protected, mediated, and sometimes even blessed before departure. Despite their staggering achievements, what's fascinating is how understated the Phoenicians were in their own records. Unlike Egyptians or Babylonians, they did not leave monumental inscriptions boasting of conquests. Their success was written not in stone, but in the daily movement of goods and ships. Their legacy, in many ways, has been pieced together from the artifacts they left behind in faraway lands: shards of purple, dyed fabric, fragments of glass, inscriptions using their alphabet, and shipwrecks resting on ocean floors. What emerges from this evidence is a picture of a civilization powered by the sea and united by commerce, a people who understood that influence does not always require armies, walls, or kings. Sometimes it requires ships, skill, trust, and the courage to sail beyond the horizon in search of opportunity. And that, more than anything else, explains how a small cluster of city-states along the eastern Mediterranean shoreline became the brokers of a world far larger than themselves. Their trade networks were not just routes. They were arteries through which the lifeblood of ancient economies flowed. Through these routes, ideas traveled, cultures met, and the ancient world became more interconnected than ever before. In the end, the Phoenicians built an empire that existed not on land but across waves, an empire that carried their influence from the Levant to Spain, from North Africa to the British Isles, from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. Their legacy endures not through monuments but through impact, an impact woven into the languages, technologies, and cultures of countless civilizations that followed. The Phoenician alphabet did not emerge suddenly or fully formed, nor did it arise from a single moment of inspiration. It evolved slowly, shaped by centuries of practical needs, cultural exchanges, and the daily activities of merchants, sailors, artisans, and scribes who lived in bustling coastal cities where communication had to be swift, efficient, and adaptable. To understand how this script transformed the ancient world, you have to imagine the environment in which it first took shape, a world where trade moved faster than the ability of most civilizations to keep up, where goods, ideas, and people were constantly shifting across the Mediterranean, and where an entire economy relied on the accuracy of contracts, shipments, and records. Before the Phoenicians, writing systems existed, of course. The Egyptians had their hieroglyphs, beautiful, elaborate symbols that decorated temple walls and tombs, but were too complex for daily commercial use. Mesopotamians had cuneiform, impressive, durable, and sophisticated, yet demanding years of training to master. Even the Proto-Sinaitic and early Canaanite scripts, from which the Phoenician alphabet partly descended, were clumsy, inconsistent, and still tied to older pictographic traditions. Writing was a specialized skill, mostly restricted to priests, elite scribes, royal administrators, and the literate classes who worked within centralized states. The Phoenicians lived in a different reality. Their society depended not on monumental inscriptions or temple bureaucracies, but on constant travel and exchange. A ship leaving Tyre might stop in Cyprus, Rhodes, Crete, Sicily, Malta, Carthage, and Spain before returning home. Each stop involved negotiations, payments, contracts, inventories, and agreements that needed to be understood by people who did not share a common language. Scribes trained for years were not always available aboard a merchant ship, nor could a trader afford to hire one in every port. What the Phoenicians required was a writing system that was simple, versatile, easy to learn, and efficient enough for rapid notation. It is from these pressures, practical, commercial, and cross-cultural, that the Phoenician alphabet unfolded. The brilliance of their script lay in its radical simplicity. Instead of hundreds of symbols, they reduced writing to around 22 characters. Each represented a consonant sound. There were no elaborate pictograms, no marks that required artistic talent, and no need for clay tablets or stone carving. A stylus on papyrus, a brush on pottery, a chisel on wood, all could carry the alphabet. The Phoenicians built a system that could be mastered in weeks instead of years, and this democratized literacy in a way older civilizations had never considered. This simplification was not merely a convenience, it became a catalyst for cultural transformation. When writing becomes accessible, everything changes. Trade expands because records become reliable, laws become clearer, cultures exchange ideas more rapidly, stories, myths, and histories survive longer. The Phoenician alphabet, because it could be learned and used by ordinary merchants, helped ideas move across borders almost as quickly as goods. We often forget how revolutionary this was. Imagine a merchant entering a foreign port. Instead of relying on memory or interpreters, he could pull out a simple tablet and write down quantities, prices, and agreements using a script that many other Mediterranean peoples would eventually recognize. Contracts could be carried long distances without fear that they might be misread. Goods could be labeled clearly. Ship captains could record routes, winds, and landmarks. This was not just writing. It was a tool for precision and consistency in a world where long-distance trade was expanding faster than any political system could regulate. The origins of the Phoenician alphabet lie in older Semitic scripts, especially the Proto-Canaanite writing found in the region centuries before, but the Phoenicians were the ones who stripped it down, standardized it, and, most importantly, spread it. Because their ships traveled everywhere, their alphabet traveled too. It appeared on pottery, cargo tags, trade weights, monumental inscriptions, wooden tablets, and even graffiti left behind by sailors in foreign ports. The script moved with the same rhythm as their commerce. Over time, other cultures recognized the utility of the Phoenician system. The Greeks were among the first to adopt it, and in doing so, they added something crucial: vowels. The Phoenician script focused on consonants, as many Semitic languages could be read without explicit vowel notation. Greek required vowels to be clear. When the Greeks adapted the alphabet, They reassigned some Phoenician letters that represented consonant sounds absent in Greek and used them to signify vowel sounds. This innovation gave birth to the classical Greek alphabet, a direct descendant of the Phoenician script. From Greek came Latin. From Latin came countless modern alphabets used across Europe, the Americas, Africa, and beyond. Meanwhile, other Phoenician-influenced scripts evolved separately: Aramaic, Hebrew, Nabatean, and many others. Through Aramaic came the alphabetic traditions of Persia, Central Asia, and even the Indian subcontinental scripts. In a very real sense, much of the world's written communication today traces its lineage back to the practical scribbles of Phoenician traders marking down shipments on crates of cedar wood or jars of purple dye. But to appreciate the magnitude of this alphabetic revolution, one must step into the daily life of a Phoenician city. In ports like Sidon, Byblos, and Tyre, the air was thick with the sound of hammers striking metal, the smell of dye vats simmering with murex glands, and the constant movement of sailors unloading crates. Amid this activity, small workshops existed where scribes trained children of merchant families. Lessons were simple, straightforward symbols, each representing a sound, practiced until the pupil mastered them. No ornate curves, no complex ideograms, just lines and angles, easy to remember and reproduce. Think of a young apprentice sitting in one of these workshops. He holds a small piece of pottery shard, a common writing surface called an ostracon. With a reed pen, he practices the shapes: Aleph, Beth, Gimel, Daleth. The sequence forms the basis of what we now call the alphabet. As he practices, he is unknowingly participating in one of history's most consequential developments. Even within the Phoenician world, the alphabet began reshaping society. Merchants gained more independence. They no longer needed scribes at every turn. Artisans could mark their creations with signatures. Ship crews could keep logs. Young people from common families could learn to write, breaking down old hierarchies. Literacy, while still limited, became more attainable than ever before. What's fascinating is that the Phoenicians themselves did not view their alphabet as a grand cultural achievement. They saw it as a tool. Their writings, what little survives, tend to be humble inscriptions, dedications to gods, ownership labels, funerary markers, commercial notes. They did not leave long literary masterpieces like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Their legacy in writing is not measured by what they wrote, but by what they enabled others to write. Perhaps this humility explains why the Phoenicians often remain overshadowed by larger civilizations. Egypt built pyramids, Mesopotamia built ziggurats, Greece built philosophy, Rome built empire. The Phoenicians built something that seems simple, but was infinitely more influential. A bridge between spoken and written language that ordinary people could cross. The alphabet spread across the Mediterranean was not instantaneous. It required decades, centuries even, of interaction, but because the Phoenicians traveled constantly, the script found new homes with ease. Greek potters copied the letters. Cypriot scribes modified them. Carthaginians preserved them in their own Punic script. The influence rippled outward until entire regions that once relied on complex writing systems began to shift toward alphabets. In some places, the transition was dramatic. In Greece, the adoption of a Phoenician-based script paved the way for written versions of epic poems that had been preserved orally for generations. Without an alphabet, the Iliad and the Odyssey might never have been recorded and transmitted through history. In Rome, the Latin alphabet derived from Greek would go on to become one of the most widely used writing systems in the world. In Israel and Judah, adaptations of the Phoenician script became the foundation of Hebrew writing, which preserved sacred texts that shaped billions of lives over millennia. But while the external influence of the Phoenician alphabet is widely recognized, the internal mechanics behind its creation are equally important. The Phoenicians had a unique relationship with language. Their Semitic tongue was suited to consonantal writing. They could infer vowel sounds from context, allowing them to condense syllables into simpler symbols. This linguistic compatibility made the alphabet not just practical, but natural for them. The shape of the letters themselves reflected the Phoenicians' environment. Many symbols derived from earlier pictographs: a stylized ox head, a house, a camel, a door. Over time, these became abstract, but their origins remained faintly visible. The alphabet carried echoes of a visual world that the Phoenicians no longer needed to draw literally. The symbols were efficient, adaptable, and visually distinct, allowing people to recognize them even on rough surfaces or materials that degraded over time. As their trade networks expanded westward, the alphabet followed. In the bustling markets of Carthage, Punic scribes continued using variants of the script long after the original Phoenician cities declined. In Spain, inscriptions show how local Iberian cultures began interacting with the alphabet. Even in North Africa, the influence of Punic writing endured for centuries, surviving in modified forms long after Rome destroyed Carthage. The Phoenicians rarely forced their culture on others. Unlike the Assyrians, Babylonians, or later empires, they did not impose their script through conquest. Instead, the alphabet spread naturally, pulled into new lands by the sheer usefulness of its design. In this sense, it was the world's first viral idea, a technology so efficient that it needed no political power to propagate. It's also important to recognize the psychological component of their writing system. When writing becomes simple, it changes how people think. Complex scripts create barriers. Simple scripts open doors. Communities that might have remained orally focused began experimenting with written communication. Stories were recorded instead of forgotten. Laws became more consistent. Religious traditions gained permanence. The alphabet functioned as a stabilizing force across cultures. Archaeologists uncover Phoenician inscriptions in unexpected places: on amulets in Cyprus, on wine jars in Italy, on temple dedications in Malta, on tombstones in Sardinia. Each inscription tells a small story: a merchant marking ownership, a traveler giving thanks to a deity, an official recording a name. These small stories collectively reveal a wide cultural footprint, one that extended across a world far larger than the geographical borders of their homeland. What's remarkable is how easily the alphabet adapted. Unlike cuneiform, which required specific tools and clay tablet techniques, the Phoenician script could be written with almost anything: ink, paint, charcoal, styluses, chisels. It could be carved on stone, inked onto parchment, scratched onto pottery, or inscribed on metal. This versatility allowed it to survive in diverse environments. In many ways, the alphabet mirrored the Phoenician world, flexible, mobile, and practical. It was not tied to temples, kings, or elite institutions. It belonged to whoever needed it. It flowed from port to port, just as goods and stories flowed. Over time, the alphabet became one of the most transformative technologies in human history. Entire civilizations built their literary traditions on its foundation. Philosophers, poets, lawmakers, scientists, historians, and religious leaders all benefited from a writing system born in the small coastal cities of the Levant. The spread of alphabetic writing enabled the preservation of knowledge on a scale impossible in the age of pictograms and syllabaries, and yet, through all this, the Phoenicians themselves remained largely silent. They did not mythologize their achievement. They did not claim divine inspiration or royal patronage. Instead, They quietly used their alphabet to label cargo, write contracts, mark graves, and communicate across seas. Their silence is ironic, considering the monumental impact of their invention. But perhaps this humility is what made the alphabet so enduring. It was not an imperial script. It was not tied to an ideology. It was simply useful, and because of that, it spread faster and farther than any writing system before it. Imagine, for a moment, the world without the Phoenician alphabet. Without it, Greece might never have recorded its epics. Rome might not have standardized its laws. Hebrew scriptures might have struggled to survive unchanged. European literature, as we know it, might never have taken shape. Alphabetic writing might have taken centuries longer to evolve, delaying the spread of literacy, knowledge, and communication across continents. Instead, thanks to the practical brilliance of a seafaring people who valued efficiency over ornament, the ancient world entered a new era of written clarity. In every modern alphabet, in the Latin letters we use today, in the Greek script still taught in schools, in Hebrew inscriptions on ancient scrolls, in Arabic signs across vast regions, you can find faint echoes of those early Phoenician symbols. The shapes changed, the sounds shifted, the scripts evolved, but the underlying idea remains: simple signs representing sounds, forming words that capture human thought. This idea began on the docks of Sidon, the markets of Byblos, the shipyards of Tyre. It began with sailors who needed a quick way to record goods, with merchants who needed to communicate across languages, with artisans who needed to mark ownership. It began with ordinary people trying to solve everyday problems. And from those small, practical needs emerged one of the greatest cultural revolutions in human history. In the end, the Phoenician alphabet was more than a writing system. It was a doorway through which countless civilizations stepped into the world of literacy. It was a vessel carrying not just words, but the potential for new ideas, connections, and transformations. It was the quiet gift of a people who believed in efficiency, exchange, and communication. Long after the Phoenician cities fell, long after their ships stopped crossing the Mediterranean, long after their purple dye faded from royal robes, their alphabet lived on reshaped, renamed, reborn, and it continues to live in every typed message, every printed book, every classroom, and every language descended from that ancient script, a legacy that endures not in stone, but in the very letters we use to speak across time. The legacy of the Phoenicians is like a vast tapestry woven from countless threads, some bright and bold, others faint and nearly forgotten, many hidden beneath layers of later civilizations. To explore their legacy is to peel back the surface of history and discover how deeply their influence penetrates into the foundations of the world we live in today. Their cities may have crumbled, their names may have faded from memory for many, and their stories may have dimmed under the shadow of great empires, but their imprint endures in ways both visible and invisible. To understand this legacy, you must trace the echoes of their presence across continents, languages, cultures, and centuries. When the great Phoenician cities, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Arwad, began declining under the pressure of foreign conquest, the world that once centered around their maritime networks shifted. Empires rose from the east, the Assyrians with their iron armies, the Babylonians with their wealth and ambition, and later, the Persians with their vast administrative machine. Each one sought to control the coastal cities because they recognized their strategic importance. But conquering a city does not erase a culture. The Phoenicians, through centuries of adaptation, were used to foreign domination. They had lived alongside Egyptians, Hittites, and Canaanites. They understood diplomacy in a way few ancient peoples did. Instead of resisting in massive battles they could not win, They often used negotiation, tribute, and alliances to preserve autonomy. Their cities were not united like Greece or centralized like Egypt. Each acted independently, navigating political storms on its own terms. Tyre might resist, Sidon might comply, Byblos might negotiate, and Arwad might switch sides, all depending on circumstance. This lack of political cohesion may have made them vulnerable, but it also ensured that their culture survived in scattered, resilient forms. When one city fell, another endured. Over time, however, repeated invasions took their toll. Assyrian brutality crushed resistance with fire and blood. Babylonian armies under Nebuchadnezzar II famously besieged Tyre for 13 years. Later, under Persian rule, the Phoenicians found relative peace, but were drawn into imperial naval campaigns. When Alexander the Great marched eastward, the Phoenicians faced yet another conqueror. His siege of Tyre became legendary, not because Tyre fell quickly, but because it resisted fiercely. The island city held out for months, forcing Alexander to construct a massive causeway to reach its walls. When he finally breached the city, he punished Tyre harshly, but the spirit of Phoenician resilience lived on. What survived the fall of their political power was not an empire of land, but an empire of influence, silent, deep-rooted, and remarkably enduring. One of the strongest pillars of Phoenician legacy rests in Carthage, their greatest colony. While the mother cities waned, Carthage rose. What began as a small outpost became a maritime titan, inheriting the seafaring spirit of its founders. Carthage adopted and expanded Phoenician trade networks, establishing dominance across the western Mediterranean. Its harbors were engineering marvels, its merchant fleets vast, its military navy formidable. Punic culture, descended from Phoenician heritage, thrived in North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain. Carthage became the new face of Phoenician power, but with success came rivalry, especially with Rome. The clash between these two powers in the Punic Wars became one of the most defining military conflicts of antiquity. Hannibal, the brilliant Carthaginian general, marched his troops, including war elephants, across the Alps to challenge Rome in its own territory. His victories stunned the ancient world, and his tactical genius influenced military strategy for thousands of years. Few realize that Hannibal spoke a Phoenician language, worshipped Phoenician gods, and commanded soldiers from a Phoenician-descended civilization. Even though Rome eventually destroyed Carthage in 146 BC, burning the city and attempting to erase its memory, the Punic identity did not disappear. Instead, it survived in subtle forms, in language, religion, art, and agricultural practices. Many North African communities continued speaking Punic for centuries, some possibly as late as the 5th century CE. The Phoenician alphabet, adapted into Punic script, remained in use long after the city had fallen. Even St. Augustine, the renowned Christian philosopher from North Africa, mentioned hearing rural people speak a Punic dialect. The Romans unknowingly preserved aspects of Phoenician culture as well. Their naval techniques, their trade routes, their harbor designs, all bore traces of Phoenician innovation. Rome may have conquered the Phoenician world, but Rome also absorbed it. Beyond Carthage's legacy, the Phoenicians left their fingerprints on religion. Their pantheon, centered around deities like Baal, Astarte, Melkart, Eshmun, and Tanit, influenced neighboring cultures in subtle ways. Melkart, the patron god of Tyre, became equated with Heracles by the Greeks. Astarte, a goddess of love and fertility, influenced the cult of Aphrodite. Tanit, the Carthaginian mother goddess, remained a powerful symbol in North Africa long into the Roman period. The spread of Phoenician religion was not the result of forced proselytizing, but rather the natural diffusion that occurs when sailors, merchants, and migrants carry beliefs from one land to another. The institution of sacred prostitution, temple rituals, and elaborate offerings became sources of fascination and controversy among Greeks and Romans, who both admired and criticized these customs. Some scholars argue that even aspects of early Israelite religion were shaped by Phoenician practices due to close geographic and cultural proximity. The story of Jezebel, a Phoenician princess from Sidon who married the Israelite King Ahab, reflects this cultural interaction. Through her, we glimpse how Phoenician royal traditions and beliefs could influence foreign courts. Another enduring element of their legacy lies deep in the foundations of art and craftsmanship. Phoenician artisans were highly sought after for their skill in metalworking, ivory carving, jewelry production, and glassmaking. Their designs often blended Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Aegean influences, creating a unique hybrid style that traveled across the Mediterranean. Phoenician glasswork, in particular, enjoyed immense popularity. Their techniques for producing translucent and colored glass paved the way for later innovations by Romans, who perfected the craft. Archaeologists frequently uncover Phoenician jewelry, scarabs, amulets, and carved ivories in places far removed from their homeland: Greece, Italy, Spain, Cyprus, even regions of North Africa. These artifacts reveal the extent to which Phoenician aesthetics permeated other cultures. Their eye for beauty was subtle, intricate, and often symbolic. They incorporated motifs such as the lotus, the sphinx, the rosette, and the sacred tree, symbols that carried spiritual significance across multiple civilizations. In this way, the Phoenicians became cultural transmitters. They did not simply create art, they spread it widely, entwining their visual language with the artistic traditions of countless others. One cannot speak of Phoenician legacy without revisiting their most monumental gift, the alphabet. Although Part 5 explores its development and spread, its legacy deserves deeper reflection here. The alphabet's influence outlived every other aspect of Phoenician civilization. It enabled literacy on a scale that ancient pictographic systems could never achieve. It democratized writing. It allowed oral traditions to become written texts. It gave birth to literate societies that produced philosophy, law, history, religion, poetry, and science. Every book in the modern world, every printed sentence, every handwritten note, every digital message shows something to those early Phoenician characters scratched into clay, inked onto papyrus, or etched on stone. Their influence is also preserved in place names. Lebanon's ancient cities still carry Phoenician names: Sidon, Tyre, Byblos. Malta's name likely derives from the Phoenician word maleth, meaning refuge or haven. Cadiz in Spain originates from the Phoenician gadir, meaning fortress. Carthage comes from Carthagast, meaning new city. Even the word Europe may have connections to a Phoenician myth. The continent's identity, etched into world history, carries a trace of their presence. Their maritime knowledge also formed a subtle legacy. The Greeks credited the Phoenicians with introducing them to navigation by the Phoenician star, which we now know as Polaris. Phoenician sailors relied on this star for long-distance travel, especially at night. Their understanding of winds, currents, and seasonal patterns influenced later seafaring cultures, with each